You are listening to the Apex Hour hosted by Ryan Paul on KSUU Thunder 91.1. This show allows more personal time with our guests, allowing them to give us their stories and opinions. We will also give you new music to listen to, hoping you enjoy some new sounds and genres. Welcome to this episode of the Apex Hour.
Welcome to the Apex Radio Hour. I'm producer Kason Graff, and I'm joined today in the studio with Director of Apex and Professor of History Ryan Paul, and our special guest, Dr. Kurt Graham. I'll turn it over to you, Ryan.
Thank you, Kason. So we're here today with Dr. Kurt Graham. He is a historian, museum director. He currently is the director of the Adams Presidential Center in Massachusetts, covering both John and John Quincy Adams. Most recently, he spent nearly a decade as the director of the Harry S. Truman Presidential Library, and we'll get into all that. He is here on campus. He delivered the this year's Howard R. Driggs Memorial Lecture, and we're very excited to have Dr. Graham with us. So thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure.
So one of the questions I always like to start with is kind of how we get to now. So can you briefly just tell us where you're from and kind of how you ended up where you are?
You know, that is a very interesting question because I did not necessarily set out to be a museum guy. I didn't even necessarily set out to be a professor. I just knew I didn't want to get a job, so I stayed in school and ended up as a professor and enjoyed that very much and had an opportunity to go into the museum library world. So went to the Buffalo Bill Center of the West from San Bernardino, Cal State San Bernardino, where I had taught originally after grad school. And from there went to the Church History Museum, went from there to Truman, and then now to Adams. So I don't know, maybe that looks like a short attention span. For me, it was a logical extension of the last thing I did. It all kind of pointed to moving in that new direction. I like to say that people say, how did you get to this point? How do you become a museum director? I always say, well, I quit a lot of good jobs to get there. And I don't know that I would recommend the path. It might not even be responsible. But it worked out for me because I think the next thing was there, and the opportunity cost, is only the next best thing. It's not everything. Nobody can do everything, but I've certainly enjoyed and learned a great deal in the various positions that I've been privileged to hold.
So we should say that the Church History Museum is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I mean, but it's called the Church History Museum in Salt Lake. Yeah. So where did you grow up?
Wyoming, northern Wyoming, primarily.
So let me ask you this question then. What's the first thing you ever remember wanting to be when you were growing up?
It's funny when I think as a kid, I was good at math and science, and so I think the assumption was I would be some sort of engineer. And I just remember as a young, like even in elementary school, thinking like, oh, being a dentist would be cool. Maybe I'll be a dentist, or just those sort of things that you don't really know what that even means. And then when the first time you see someone wince in pain or you witness some blood, you think, well, no, that's not really where I'm going to be. I would be that guy clammy on the floor,
Which is ironic that you became a historian, because I see lots of people wince in pain.
Yes.
When I walk into the room.
Exactly,
right?
Exactly. Yeah, it's a different kind of pain, though. I can almost derive a demonic kind of pleasure from that pain. It's different.
So this young kid in Wyoming, what leads you to say, I want to go into history? Is there a eureka moment that you find this, or was it just, how did that happen?
It's funny because I was an English undergraduate and I was really into literature, and that seemed more, I think the reason I chose history for grad school instead of staying in literature was I just couldn't stand all the theory stuff. And so I thought the way we tell stories and the importance of the stories and the value of those stories to an audience were always important to me, and I didn't feel like I could achieve that in a literary criticism world. I'm not saying that people don't. There are a lot of really smart people who do that. I just wasn't cut out for that.
It's interesting as you think, just you and I have known each other for 15 years or so in different capacities, but it's interesting your career has gone from being an academic historian into public history.
Uh-huh.
And mine was almost the reverse, right?
Right?
I went into public history after graduate school and then came to the university. So I do want to talk a little bit about your perception and idea of the importance of public history. So first, can you just kind of define that in your own words of what you think a public historian is and does?
Well, it's funny because I never in my wildest dreams, once I sort of decided I would go into academia, once I was going to get a PhD, once I knew that I would teach. I love teaching. I love students. I love research and writing. I mean, there's no reason for me not to still be at the academy, except that I just couldn't see myself doing that forever. And it was funny when the opportunity came along to go to Cody, and I just was from Northern Wyoming, and it was more of a personal kind of family decision. It wasn't this big career moment that said, oh, you've got to shift gears and go do this. It was like, oh, my parents are up there, my kids are young, it's a great place to live. Seemed like a logical thing to do. So it's not like it was such a conscious career trajectory move, but and as you move into a different field, you look at the field you left and the field you're going into differently. So my view of public history as an academic was different than my view of public history once I was a practitioner. And my view of academia changed too as I got some distance from it and got away from it. And like I said, to me, the storytelling, the opportunity to share with people, I always felt that my academic friends it never really dawned on them that there was an audience for their work. Just the fact that they put it out was enough. And I just came to realize, no, that's not right. I mean, you have to shape things and pitch things and put things together in a way that will stimulate interest and that will cause people to want to engage in the topic. And you're not doing deep research dives in a museum. It's a 101 level course that you want people to get as they go through the museum, but you hope that you've sparked interest. And a lot of my academic friends, I don't think they even thought about whether they sparked interest. The interesting thing was they were there.
I think it's also interesting that you move from the telling the story in some ways of the LDS Church, and you shift to Truman and Independence, which also was relevant to members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints as well. But did you have a connection with Harry Truman specifically, or is it the fact that this was the job that was open and just felt right to you?
Well, yeah, there were other presidential libraries that would appeal to me for a number of reasons. But no, there was a great irony. I studied the early republic, the revolution, in graduate school, and wrote my dissertation in about 1790s, the early republic, early 1800s. And then I went off and made my living with Buffalo Bill, Joseph Smith, and Harry Truman, and far afield from anything I'd ever studied. And then now at the Adams Center, what's so wonderful for me is to come back full circle and to be back working in the American Revolution and the early American Republic, even though I haven't really been in the field in the way that a true academic who'd stayed in the field from the time I was in grad school would. So there's a lot that I am catching up on, again, reacquainting myself with. But it's wonderful to be back in a period that I really sort of cut my teeth on, in the sense that these are the interesting questions to me of the Republic, and about our country and how it got put together and why things are the way they are. There are a lot of interesting things that happen, obviously, after that, but I think that founding moment is like no other, and I'm really grateful to be thinking about and working in that time period again.
So in doing that, and we'll talk more about the Adams Center here in a little bit, but what are the qualities you see that make a good storyteller or a good historian? I take that back. I think good historians are storytellers. But what qualities do you see are necessary to do that kind of work?
To the extent that I know anything about it, I've learned by watching some of the greats. I mean, I was very privileged because of my role at Truman to get to know David McCullough quite well, and he was just a dear friend and wonderful man. I regret so much that he passed before we could talk about the Adams Center together, because I think he would have been very, very excited about that work. But I know his children, know his family well, and they're wonderful people, and I'm happy to talk about his legacy with them, because he was someone who was just such a natural and gifted storyteller, and he had, the way he wrote was not so much concerned with the historical argument, even though he was steeped and versed in all those things as well. But he wanted to know, why did this happen? What happened? How do we explain this? when, how did this bridge get built? How did this flood, how did it impact this community? How did all these things come together? And, his decision to focus on Truman, for example. And he admitted later that if he had known it was going to take a full decade to write the Truman book, he probably never would have started. But I'm so grateful that he didn't know that.
So you're Truman. You shift to Adams, which was one of McCullough's books as well in 1776. So are you going to shift back to, you're going to run the Johnstown Historical Society as you move next?
Yeah, I think that'd be a great kind of retirement gig for me, just go to the Flood Museum. No, but I mean, I throw David out as a great example of a storyteller. Certainly, Doris Kearns Goodwin is another great example of really high-level storytelling. I think the people who connect, Nathaniel Philbrick, people who connect with an audience around a topic and that ordinary people say, wow, I want to know more about that. I want to learn about that. To me, that is way more thrilling than to go to a conference and have someone say, oh, your last argument was amazing. I just can't believe that book was, who cares? That stuff is so fleeting, but I think when you can lay out a story that people can learn from and benefit from. And I think that's really what museum work is at its best. If you can lay out a story and people can leave. The greatest compliment I think our staff at Truman ever got was when people were leaving the Truman Library, leaving that wonderful reimagined exhibit that we had built together. People would say, I had no idea that Truman did all that stuff. Like they learned so much, they were just floored at the number of things that he was involved with. And I think that is success, that they will never hear his name or think of him or think of that time period again without referencing the visuals and the ideas that they picked up in that gallery that will give them a whole new understanding of that part of our history.
Yeah, I've often found that public history is much harder to do than academic history. I teach classes in public history here at the university, and one of the things I tell my students is this is different. And it's harder because in an academic setting, you're meeting with people who are essentially paying you to be there, right? With students and entertain me or whatever else. But people who come to a museum or in public programming, they're choosing to give the greatest gift they have, which is their time, to do that. And you're meeting them in places where you don't know where they are.
You're meeting them where they are, exactly.
Yeah, and they don't know what they don't know, and it's much harder to do that effectively than just to get in front of a class and talk about something.
And I think that extends beyond just sort of academic teaching. I think of school teachers, for example, public school teachers, middle school, high school, elementary school teachers, and you compare that with a museum educator. I think there's a vast difference, and I have a profound respect for school teachers. But the fact is, they are dealing with kids who are all the same age, all the same, more or less the same level of understanding, and they're working on the same topics, the same assignments, the same worksheets, whatever that they work through. And so that's a certain kind of engagement with them. But a museum educator has to think about, pre-K to gray. You have to think about every single person who's going to walk through that door. And some of them are young students, some of them are parents, some of them are college-age kids, some of them are retired couples, whatever. It's very challenging to put together a program and to tell a story in a way that grandma and grandpa and a bored middle-aged dad and little kids are all going to relate to together. And when a museum does that well, you feel it. You just know that was a great staff that put that together.
Yeah, it's like the teacher. I have a colleague, a friend of mine, who does education for theater, and it's about this idea of getting down on the ground with the kids. Right, you as a public historian, you meet people sometimes literally in the sandbox and sometimes in the intellectual sandbox. You've got to be willing to engage with them, and I think that's the challenge, right? Because sometimes in an academic world, it becomes about you showing how much you know.
Right.
But in a public history world, it's not about you, and it's not about you disengage with people when you try to show them.
How much can you help them know? Absolutely.
Right.
It's different. And it's interesting too, I don't know, people are where they are. I know at the Truman Library, we made two assumptions when people walked through the door. we assumed most people probably knew that he dropped the bombs to end World War II. And we also assumed that most people would remember or recognize that he had a Buck Stops Here sign on his desk. Beyond that, we made no assumptions. We just said we have to help people understand the significance of this administration, and we can't even assume that they know where he was from or what he did or how he did it or that he was vice president or whatever. I mean, none of that stuff. We had to just take them and just let that story unfold in a way that's not condescending or that doesn't assume that people aren't stupid. They just don't know things. And there's a difference. There's a big difference there. And I think that, for a museum team to be able to put that together in a way that can cross generational lines it's really thrilling when you see that come together.
And respecting that difference.
Yes.
Respecting the audience, I think, is a key thing. That
you can't afford to be arrogant or look down on people as a museum. Or they, because as you said, they vote with their feet. I mean, they have discretionary time and discretionary dollars to spend, and they're not going to come there if it's a highbrow, and especially if it's a browbeating. They're not going to be up for that. Academics get away with that a little bit more, but it's still pointless.
Yeah. Cool. Well, let's take our first break. So those of you who've listened to our show before know that we ask our guests to give us a list of 5 or 6 songs that, for whatever reason, whatever time in their life, resonate with them, and we play those songs. Dr. Graham, Kurt gave us 6. We're going to choose 4 of those songs, and then we'll go from there. So the first song that we're going to play is a song that you sent to us. It is August by Taylor Swift. Can you tell us why you chose this song?
Well, I like she did those folk kind of albums during the pandemic, and I just like that sound. That's kind of my style of music. I think she's a very versatile artist. And because if my wife were listening, I would want her to be embarrassed about that. I mean, her birthday's in August, but there's a line in there about, I can see us tangled in bed sheets. I just think that's, an important thing to try to do from time to time, to just embarrass people. So I put that in to embarrass my wife.
There you go. Well, the embarrassment song begins. This is August by Taylor Swift. Bring.
That was Taylor Swift's August here on the Apex Radio Hour. I'll turn it back to you, Ryan.
Thank you, Kaysen. We're here in the studio with Dr. Kurt Graham, the president of the Adams Presidential Center. We're joined by our student producer, Kaysen, Kate, and Lauren Bird. Kate Scherer, I should say. So forgive me, Kate. And I should tell you, this is an interesting thing because in the studio, there's a lamp above Kate's head that kind of flickers on and off. So it's like it gets dark, and then when she has an idea, the light pops on.
Yeah. Ideas, it'll pop back.
Who, by the way, is also doing a presentation in one of my classes on the Johnstown flood.
I am. I've spent a lot of time researching that and David McCullough over the last.
That David McCullough is one of the few writers, and this is still true, I think, even since he's passed. Every one of his books is still in print.
Wow.
Really? Wow. I didn't know that.
Going back to, and that was back in the 60s when that came out, and those books are all still in print. It's a remarkable legacy.
It is, and a remarkable voice too.
Oh,
I remember he was
remarkable.
He was America's historian in many ways. So we kind of left off talking about museums and public history and what people do and don't know, and you mentioned a couple things that people assumed they would know about Harry Truman going into the Truman Library. So I'm interested in the scope of people you've worked with. You talked about Buffalo Bill. You talked about Joseph Smith or the early LDS Church. Harry Truman. I should also mention that you were the interim director of the George W. Bush Presidential Library for a year? 2 years. And now you're at the Adams Presidential Center, which also covers John and John Quincy. Is that correct? So briefly, can you give us 1 or 2 myths or legends of these people that people think are true, but in reality are not?
I think there's just a lot of... I think it's not so much that people believe things are true that are not. I think people just don't know very much about the things that are true. I think it's just more a general ignorance than it is a misunderstanding of what they are. But, it's funny the things that people focus on. I'll just give you one example from Truman. I can't tell you how many times we would get emails about how the S in Harry S. Truman doesn't stand for anything. It's just an initial. It doesn't stand for a name. And so I would get these people saying, you should not put a period after the S because it stands alone as an, and there's this convention about people who have initials that are not abbreviations. And of course, our answer was always, well, that's fine. You're right. It doesn't stand for anything. But the problem is Harry Truman often put the period in his signature himself. So we kind of follow what the man himself did. That's the thing. But people can get really worked up over the smallest things that they're certain about, that they know. And so I don't know that it's so much that there's a great mythology around these. I mean, I would argue, I bet you most Americans couldn't say 2 or 3 things about John Quincy Adams. I doubt they could say that many more things about John Adams, even with his founding legacy. So I worry less about people insisting on things that they believe than just that they don't engage the topic and they don't really know much about these people at all.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that we think about that, because I remember in one of my visits to the Truman years ago that I'm assuming that I've been to a few presidential libraries, but I'm assuming that one of the things they all have is some kind of mock-up of the Oval Office. Mm-hmm. Is that standard?
Yeah, I think for the most part, they usually have a replica of some kind. Sometimes it's a half cutaway thing to walk into or something. But
so the thing I remember is in the Harry Truman office, there's this gigantic corn cob in what is it? Like
lucite or something.
Lucite, yeah. And I remember thinking, what's the story there? And no one knows. Is that right? Like it was just we can't ask President Truman anymore of why on earth do you have a giant corn cob?
Yeah. And I think it's pretty obvious that, he comes from the Midwest. I'm sure that when lucite, when people realized they could suspend things, that was kind of a cool thing. And I'm sure it came from the Farm Bureau or something at some point, to remind him of his agricultural roots. But no, the curators, the people who'd been there for years, when I got there, I said, what's up with the corn cob? No idea.
And there is a story, the buck stops here is not a regular, it wasn't there all the time in his Oval Office, right?
It wasn't in the Oval Office. The picture you see with Truman with that sign was actually in the Oval Office at the library, not in the Oval Office in Washington.
So he never had it as a president.
That's what I understand. It was never part of his desk in the Oval Office, in the real Oval Office.
I remember one of the first things I bought at the Truman Library when I went decades ago was a buck stops here sign that's been on every desk that I've ever had since that time. But I'm not from Missouri because it says I'm from Missouri.
It says I'm from Missouri on the back, which is interesting because that's Truman's view of the sign.
Oh, that's true. I didn't think about that.
From where he sat at the desk, he had to remind himself that he was a Missourian.
So we could talk, as you know, I'm a big Harry Truman fan. We could talk about Truman a lot. Let's talk about John Adams a little bit. So the Adams Presidential Center is new. Well, I guess let's step back and talk about presidential libraries in general, because I don't think a lot of people know how these kind of quasi-public-private organizations are set up. Can you talk about kind of the history of those?
Well, yeah, the presidential library system that we have with the National Archives, that runs from Hoover to the present day. And those libraries are early on, back, FDR started the system. He wanted a place to put his papers, and he wanted people to be able to study his administration, warts and all. So he chose to put those papers. Now, in those days, and Truman did the same, in those days, the papers were the personal property of the president. And so they chose to keep those papers around. They could have burned them. I mean, they could have gotten rid of them. But they didn't. They had a sense of history, and they wanted to do that. And then it was Truman who went back and grandfathered Hoover into the system because he was already out of office. So the system runs from Hoover to the present day. Now, what happened with that system, the president would raise some money, build the building, turn the building over to the federal government, and then donate. They were called deed of gift libraries. They would donate the building and donate the artifacts, donate the collections, the papers, and those would be cared for in perpetuity by the government. What happened in the late 70s with the Watergate tapes and other things like that where people started suddenly asking, what would happen if the president didn't give over the papers or didn't give over the artifacts? Well, they passed something called the Presidential Records Act, which applies to every library from Ronald Reagan forward. So in the case of Reagan, the case of Bush, Clinton, and so on, the papers are the property of the people of the United States. The artifacts are also similarly, because the president, for tax reasons, doesn't want to keep those things personally, so they give them to the National Archives to take care of. So this is important now because these deed of gift libraries, this is not optional. Like, these papers belong to the people. And that's where, you've seen in the headlines in recent years, the Mar-a-Lago thing and everything, that was about the fact that, no, those aren't personal records. Those are by law the property of the people. And so that kind of system, that public-private partnership, again, the president doesn't have to build a museum, and it remains to be seen. Will Biden build a museum? Will Trump build a museum? I don't know. I assume their supporters will want to do something to acknowledge them, but they're not obligated to do that by any means. But the artifacts and the papers belong to the people. So there is currently, there's a Biden library, there's a Trump library. They're digital at the moment. That's all. They're just an online thing. If the presidents choose to build something, they can. So when you go back earlier, you think of, what about the other libraries? What about like the Lincoln Library in Illinois, or you think about Mount Vernon or Monticello or Montpelier, or there are all kinds of presidential homes that have these collections and things in them. Those are all private. Those are usually 501c3 nonprofits. And so that's what the Adams Presidential Center will be as well. It's not, the papers of those older administrations they're either at the Library of Congress, National Archives, in some cases, like with the Adams papers, and frankly, a lot of the Jefferson papers, surprisingly, are at the Massachusetts Historical Society. And they're a nonprofit also that takes care of those papers. They publish the Adams Papers series, all of that. And then the artifacts are largely at the Adams home that is run by the National Park Service. So there's all kinds of different models, all kinds of different ways that this is done, but the formal sort of publicly funded presidential libraries as we know them is from Hoover to the present day.
So we're going to take a break, but I also want to, when we come back, I want to talk about then the evolution of what you envision the Adams Presidential Center adds to this structure. Mm-hmm. So let's take our second break. This is a song that I really am glad that you chose because, one, it's the first group I ever saw in concert when I was a young junior high school lad. This is a song called Harry Truman by Chicago. And this is the funk Chicago. This isn't the, post
Peter
Cetera.
Yeah.
I guess he was there, but this isn't the, you're the meaning inspiration Chicago, right?
Right.
So tell me why you chose this song, Harry Truman.
Well, this is interesting because this song was written shortly after Truman's death in the 1970s. And I remember the president's grandson, who's a good friend of mine, Clifton Truman Daniel, he was in college at that time, or in the mid-'70s, and he said some roommate down the hall, some dorm buddy came down and said, "Hey, Clifton, come and listen to this song." And it was the first time that it sort of, he knew his grandfather had been president, but the idea that Harry had left that kind of impact, that kind of legacy. The refrain of the song is "America needs you, Harry Truman." What we wouldn't give to have another Harry Truman. And it's probably not in the annals of rock and roll history, probably not a great song by any stretch. But I think the fact that a band in the mid-'70s thought to stop and pay homage to Harry Truman, especially in the aftermath of Watergate and the aftermath of Vietnam, the fact that, and I had so many people tell me that at the library, would to God we had another Harry Truman. And so this song always kind of inspired me in that way.
Okay. This is Harry Truman by Chicago. Bring.
That was Harry Truman by Chicago. You're listening to the Apex Radio Hour here on KSUU Thunder 91.1. I'll turn it back to you, Ryan.
Thank you. So, thanks, Kason. So we're here with Dr. Kurt Graham, the president of the Adams Presidential Center. And let's talk about what the need for the Adams Presidential Center, one, how does it come about, and what do you see it becoming?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's kind of shocking, really, that there's nothing ever been done for the Adams at this level. We have Monticello, we have Mount Vernon, we have Montpelier. We have nothing on that level for the Adams legacy. And as I mentioned to you earlier, the Adams legacy, John Adams' legacy, is the only founding legacy not tainted by slavery. And so I think there's a timeliness to this that says, in this era of Black Lives Matter, in this era of Me Too, someone like John Adams is maybe an important leader to remember that, it didn't have to be. It wasn't just the context of the time that created these other things. There were choices that were made. And John Adams made a choice, and his son John Quincy made a choice, that they weren't going to be part of a slaveholding society. I mean, they wanted to try and make those changes. And, they had very strong feelings, moral feelings about the institution of slavery. And so I think there's a relevance to it in that way in terms of our own civil rights dialogues and the kinds of things that are going on in our country today. In terms of what we envision, I think that the Adams Presidential Center is primarily an educational institution. I think what we care about is sharing that history of the Adams, but also rooting it in their values in such a way that we hope that that our programming will be inspiring, especially to a rising generation, to look at what can be, what is possible. Even when the tide is moving one way in your culture and your society, you can actually be a voice for change, and you can actually affect change if you go about it in the right way. So I think there is a definite need. We'll be very focused on civics education, which is a huge need in our schools. The schools, in a lot of ways, for budget cuts and other reasons, have abdicated that responsibility to teach students what it means to be a citizen, that there's a duty and a responsibility there. And I think that we can draw on the example of the Adams to help people understand that, no, you can give yourself to public service, and you can make a difference for your family and for the people around you. And I think that it's an inspiring story in that way. It's a story filled with personal sacrifice. It's a family that gave a lot. They didn't have a lot, but they gave themselves. My favorite quote that I shared earlier about John Adams, our obligations to our country never cease but with our lives. I mean, he was all in. And I think that we need a citizenry again that is all in, that understands what's at stake. And so I think that there's a timeliness about what we're doing with the Adams Presidential Center. And I think we will be primarily an educational institution that does, K-12 type education, but also public programs, and we want to touch every citizen from beginning, middle, and end. I mean, we want people to take citizenship seriously.
So is there going to be a physical building like a museum you can go to, or is it mostly in the digital realm? Or
No, that's a great question. No, that we are in the process of getting ready to launch a campaign to raise money to build a building. That building will include a museum element. It'll be probably mostly digital and interactive, as opposed to, we don't have an artifact collection, we don't have an archive collection, and we don't intend to develop one. The good documents are at Mass Historical, the good collections are with the Park Service, artifacts, and we're not going to compete with that. We're going to partner with our friends in both of those places, and anything that comes our way will funnel to them, and we'll borrow things from time to time for display, but we're really not thinking of this as a display space as much as an education space.
Yeah, so John Adams is interesting to me. I mean, he experienced kind of a renaissance, 12 years ago with McCullough's book and the HBO series of John Adams. Why, and he's eclipsed again. I mean, this is what I find interesting, right, is that John Adams has this kind of renaissance sandwich between Washington and Jefferson, and we can see why he's kind of forgotten, because Jefferson, didn't treat him very well. But then we also see he has this brief moment in the Sun, and then all of a sudden, Alexander Hamilton. His name is Alexander Hamilton. Yeah. And the myth and the legend of Alexander Hamilton is, he's the forgotten founding father, right? No one talks about Alexander Hamilton. So John Adams, it's almost very appropriate, indicative of the poor Adams, that he just kind of pokes his head out, and then all of a sudden Hamilton comes in and steps on it again, right? And Jefferson does too. So why is John Adams, why is he overlooked in that way?
I think it's interesting because Adams, even in his lifetime, complained about the fact that he didn't get the credit that he was due. I mean, he got pretty curmudgeonly by the end of his life, I think, and he was just frustrated that he's the one that nominated George Washington to be commander-in-chief. He's the one who suggested Thomas Jefferson be the one to stylize the Declaration of Independence. In other words, without Adams, we wouldn't have had Washington as commander-in-chief. We wouldn't have had the Declaration written the way it was from the beautiful and flowery pen of Thomas Jefferson. I mean, Adams recognized and shone the spotlight on others at that time, and then was sort of ruffled by the fact that they didn't shine it back in the ways. And so Jefferson, on the other hand, acted like his legacy was no big deal to him, and then worked very hard to make sure that he would be remembered in certain ways. And I think that Washington and Jefferson, and to some degree maybe even Madison, did a much better job of sort of staging their long-term profiles on the stage of history. Adams, I think, was just, he didn't do that as well, and I think because he demanded a certain kind of deference maybe in his life. I mean, it's a good question. I don't know that I have a great answer for it, but I think that that he cared about it too much, and because of that, I think he just comes off a little petty at times, a little less than serious about some of those things, and it is unfortunate, and I do think too, because in my personal opinion, Alexander Hamilton was a twit, and it's unfortunate that we have a musical and this whole industry built up around him, because he's getting way more than he's due, way more than he deserves. And I wish Lin-Manuel Miranda had known to write about John Adams instead. It would have been a much better musical.
Well, Ron Chernow was still alive, right?
Yeah.
I mean, but I think it's interesting how this all plays out, that John Adams is almost like America's producer. Right. No one ever talks really, except around the Oscars, about who the producer of the film was.
Right.
They want to know who the director was and the actors and all that stuff. But really, it's the producer that kind of puts the whole piece together. And that's kind of, I see John Adams' role, right? Is he's the producer of all this, but never.
Yeah.
It never comes
Well, and
back.
I think another thing in terms of the founding moment to remember is that, and Jefferson sort of stepped in and claimed, there was a committee of 5 people that worked on the Declaration, and Jefferson, of course, penned it at the end and did a great job. Let's be honest. I mean, I don't want to take anything away from Jefferson, but he sort of stepped in and made sure, even on his own headstone, that it would be remembered that he was the author of the I think he called it the Declaration of American Independency. And so he was able to claim that, but the truth is, when the Constitutional Convention was going on, Adams and Jefferson were in Europe. And so they weren't a part of that founding moment. So it's easy to forget that John Adams wrote the Massachusetts Constitution that becomes the basis of all the other state constitutions, and in fact, the working, Madison brings the Virginia plan, but it was Adams who did all the heavy lifting and did all the thinking about how this structure of government would work in America. And yet, when the thing all comes together in Philadelphia, he's in London. And so he's not there to participate, to take any credit, to be a part of that discussion. So I think he was kind of, both with the Declaration and with the Constitution, he was overlooked then, and so it's easy for us to overlook him now. And if he didn't participate in those two great moments where Washington comes and presides, and he gets all the credit in the world for making that happen, Madison gets all the credit for writing that document, the Constitution. Jefferson gets all the credit for the Declaration. So these are the founding documents of our creed, and Adams' fingerprints aren't on them in the same way. I mean, they were at the time. They wouldn't have happened without him, but people don't remember that.
Well, we remember that John Adams was the husband of Abigail.
Right.
Abigail Adams, and to her credit, is an amazing woman, but is the one that now we're thinking differently about, right? That
Absolutely.
We're focusing on.
No, she's the first American feminist. And ironically, we did a program on the First Ladies recently, and with this panel, I said it's interesting that there's no doubt that John Adams has lived in the shadow of George Washington, but also Martha Washington and the other First Ladies at the time have lived in the shadow of Abigail.
Yeah. And I guess the same thing can be said in some ways about John Quincy Adams, right? I mean, I think about in my own survey class, we talk about John Quincy Adams, right? That the corrupt bargain, that he swam naked in the Potomac a lot, that he couldn't hit a shovel in the ground and hit a root and made him look stupid in front of the electorate, and Smithsonian, right? I mean, and to a lesser extent, even some ways, the Monroe Doctrine. I think it's very interesting that he also gets kind of a Jackson. He is a precursor to the age of Jackson, which we focus on specifically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that they both. I don't think John or John Quincy, either one, are what we would call today good retail politicians. Like, they didn't really understand connecting to the electorate and to the audience in that same way. I mean, John Quincy Adams would have never been elected but for Louisa Catherine. I mean, she's the one who knew how to throw the party. She knew who needed to be there. She'd grown up in the courts. I mean, until Melania Trump, she was the only first lady who was not born in the United States. You know, she was born in England. She was raised in that court, finery and all of that, and she knew how those things unfolded. And so she was able to do that. John Quincy was just a bookworm. He was off in his own little intellectual world and didn't necessarily know that he needed to relate to people, and I don't think was all that relatable. So it's not necessarily surprising that he didn't. I mean, he's probably lucky to have been president just based on his ability to campaign.
And his loose friendship with Henry Clay?
Mm-hmm. I mean, well, for sure, yeah. I mean, that didn't hurt him.
I think it's so fascinating as you think about the way we think about elections and presidents now, is that if you look at the election of 1828, where the point is that, and I guess it ties into what you talked about with John Adams, this kind of disconnect, because Jefferson portrays himself really as a man of the people. Andrew Jackson does the same. And John Quincy Adams is pointing out, well, you don't want to elect Andrew Jackson because he misspells words.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, I'm smart. I'm well read, and he loses the sight of the fact that as America is growing and expanding, what people care about is, well, if Jackson misspells words, if George Washington misspells words, then that's okay. Mm-hmm. And he just kind of misses that point. It's
right.
Like he's very obtuse to the idea of what America is becoming. Mm-hmm. Is that fair to say?
Oh, I think so. No, I think I think all those early founders, and I think that John Quincy is sort of the last gasp of that founding era. I mean, he's a boy during that time, so he's not necessarily credited as being a founder, but he certainly represents that generation in a way. And they missed so many things. I mean, Jefferson said every young man today will die a Unitarian. He had no idea. And this is at the cusp of this. I mean, the Second Great Awakening is just taking off. I mean, these revival camp meetings are going on right under his nose. And the Baptists and the Methodists and everybody, these are just exploding in population. And Jefferson says, oh, no, we're enlightened. Everybody's going to be a Unitarian. He couldn't have been further from the truth. They all said, oh, don't worry about slavery. The Enlightenment's going to kill slavery. It can't last. Well, slavery enters its most expansive era from the 18 teens and 20s up until the Civil War itself. And so John Quincy Adams, like those other founders, he just couldn't figure out what was going on right under his nose, that ordinary people were saying, no, we're here. We matter. We do care. And we are going to participate. So with Jacksonian democracy, you get this explosion of white male participation, the dropping of property requirements, that kind of thing. Now, it's not necessarily a great time to be a woman or a Native American or an African American, but it's a great time to be a white man in terms of participation. There is progress there, even though it's not the kind of progress we would necessarily care to measure today. But it nevertheless opened up the avenue to more kind of participation. I don't think John Quincy ever had that even as a goal.
Well, it's just interesting that you mentioned that, because we can kind of bring this around full circle, is that the very culture and basic threads of what America is changed as the franchise expands. Mm-hmm. As more, I call them in my class poor white men, not like you poor white guy, but economically poor people that are not like the founders, right, or the framers. As they begin to exercise what they perceive to be citizenship, which is voting, these old white guys have to change their attitude about how they're going to appeal to these people. How do you connect with someone who is so far removed from you. And then we see this happening again as participation actually begins to decline, right? We tried to expand it and it does, but now, I mean, voter participation in this election wasn't huge. We're still under the, well under 50, 60% probably in this case. And so we think about what our civic duty is and how we fought for participation. And now it seems as if political parties actively encourage us not to participate. They make it more difficult to exercise our right to vote. So I guess what I really want to get to this idea is you talk about the Adams Presidential Center in terms of civics and patriotism, right? You talked a little bit about this today, but can you really define what it means to be an American?
Well, it's interesting because that definition has changed over time as well. If you read Crevecoeur and his visit, an American is basically a landholder, something which was, from a European perspective, was a huge shift. And it was the idea that an ordinary person could cross the ocean and own property, like own land. I mean, that was definitionally just crazy. And so for these as you said, poor white guys, the poorer white classes in the Jacksonian era, to say, hey, no, we want to be a part of this. The problem then is the same as the problem now from the elite perspective. We always approach voting from the standpoint of the people who don't vote or the people who are on the lower end of the scale. The fact is, it's the elites who had the same message then as they have now, and that is, well, the wrong kind of people are voting. And that's the issue, because they will change the whole culture, right? They look at things differently than we do. And so when the wrong kind of people are voting, what does it mean to be an American? Yes, the ability to own your own property is an important part of that, but the ability to participate in the franchise, which was opened up slowly, as you know, over time. I mean, the white males, the property qualifications are dropped in the Jacksonian period. In theory, the amendments after the Civil War, 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, are supposed to be making advancements for former slaves. Jim Crow kicks in, and it's another, it's the 1960s before we really get there with voting rights and other kinds of things. And then the suffrage movement in the early 20s. So at each one of these inflection points, we get a new group of voters, and that changes. That changes everything. So certainly voting is an important part of being an American. There are only two places in our polity where we as citizens exercise our voice, use our voices unfiltered, and that is at the ballot box and the jury box. Every other place, we are represented by someone else. And so those are the only direct places where people get to have their say. And so the franchise is a hugely important part of what it means to be an American, but which is why the franchise often comes under attack from certain elites, because they want to keep it the way it is. And if we open this up to everybody, if we make it easy for everybody to vote, the dynamic will change dramatically, and there'll be huge shifts, including maybe our team will lose some power.
And it's going to require us to say things and change the way that we act and what it means to be who we are as we've designed our class. Because I'm confident that both the Adamses were concerned about expansion of the franchise, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. They were not Democrats in the sense that you would think of. I mean, they understood John Adams said democracy could well be our undoing. And whereas Jefferson was always like, oh, no, the people will never make a mistake. The people are always wise. And I've spent most of my life, I think, as a Jeffersonian really believing in that. Of late, I'm starting to think that John Adams might be onto something.
Yeah, it's interesting as you think about what we define ourselves. So as a historian of presidential legacies, spanning, as you have said, 4 centuries from John Adams all the way up to George W. Bush, what gives you hope in America? What gives you hope? I mean, because I think about this as a historian often, if I didn't have hope, I wouldn't be able to do what I do. So what gives you hope?
Well, I think that what history shows me is that we have been well led in the past, that we are capable of recruiting and selecting real leaders who can rise to the occasion. And the thing that gives me hope, not just looking backwards at that we have that experience, we know we have a track record, we know we can do that. What gives me more hope is looking forward to this rising generation and to realize that there are people among them who really do get it. I mean, I think people who teach civics or teach history, government, whatever you want to call it, and they just, they roll their eyes about, kids these days, they just don't get it, they don't read, they don't know. That's not true. That's not true. Actually, young people are eager to engage. The fault in their lack of participation lies not with them, but with us. And I think that we need to create opportunities for that engagement, because I think there is a generation that is eager to take the reins, that is eager to take us to a new level. And I'm very confident that among that burgeoning group, we will find Adams and Jeffersons and Lincolns and others who are going to rise to the occasion when we need it, because we've never been without the leader we need in the hour we've needed it.
Very cool. Thank you. That's a great way to move into our final break. This is a song that you've chosen. It's an artist that I don't know, which is, I not that I know everybody, but I have listened to her music since you mentioned it. This is a song called Trouble in the Fields by Nanci Griffith. Can you tell us why you chose this song?
Well, I love that style of music again. I love Nanci Griffith. She's gone now, but she did a lot of just amazing work. I've enjoyed her body of work over the years. But Trouble in the Fields is a song that is apropos of the conversation we were just having about their hard times, right? Their trouble in the fields. I mean, it's a Dust Bowl era song. It's kind of a ode to that period that Woody Guthrie and others chronicled so well. But it's also a very hopeful song. It's that we can work our way through this. And I know there's trouble in the fields, but you'll be the mule, I'll be the plow. Come harvest time, we'll work it out. And she says there's still a lot of love in these troubled fields. And I think that is really a great way to think about maybe where we are right now.
Okay. This is Trouble in the Fields by Nanci Griffith. Bring.
That was Trouble in the Fields by Nanci Griffith. You're listening to the Apex Radio Hour here on KSUU Thunder 91.1. I'll turn it back to you, Ryan.
Thank you, Kason. We have had an enjoyable conversation with Dr. Kurt Graham, a dear friend and mentor of mine. And thank you for being here. We're going to do our final segment, which is what's bringing us joy this week. So we'll start with you, Kurt. Kurt Graham, what are you currently watching, reading, listening to, or playing that is bringing you joy?
Oh, wow. I'm reading a lot of books about the Adams because I'm trying to catch up on that. I would say one of the best biographies I've read in a while is a biography of Louisa Catherine Adams, John Quincy's wife, by a woman named Louisa Thomas. She writes for the New Yorker, brilliant writer, really a fine book. In terms of watching, I don't watch a lot of television, although my wife and I did just watch Only Murders in the Building, which I thought was brilliant.
I've heard good things about that.
It's great. It's Steve Martin and Martin Short. Those guys are just funny no matter what. In terms of outlets and things that bring you joy, besides reading and just working and being with family and all those things, I do play a little bit. I'm a 3-chord hack on the guitar, and so I occasionally compose a little ditty or two, that some of which are suitable for the air and some are not. So it's just a question of, I do get a lot of enjoyment out of music in that way, both listening and playing around at it a little bit.
Cool. Thank you. Kate Scherer, what are you currently watching, reading, listening to, or playing that is bringing you joy?
I am currently listening to Norm Macdonald's book. It's called Based on a True Story, narrated by him, and it has just been, he led a crazy, insane life, and it's been really entertaining to hear about his life stories from the man who experienced them. So yeah, I've enjoyed that.
Norm Macdonald of Saturday Night Live
Correct.
fame.
Correct. That Norm Macdonald. Yeah.
Longtime listeners will know that our good friend Kate has been deeply
fan.
steeped
Yeah.
in the SNL world
Deeply
for,
steeped is a good.
for some time.
I think at this point, SNL has more appearances than Brandon Sanderson.
I think
on
it's
the podcast.
close.
Yeah, maybe
I think
so.
it's close.
Getting close.
Yep.
Getting close. All right, Lauren Bird, what are you currently watching, reading, listening to, or playing that is bringing you joy? I should know. I know who you're talking to that is bringing you joy.
So you probably won't be surprised because I've been talking about it a lot recently, but I've been watching season 3 of The Wheel of Time, and it's getting closer to what happens in the books. And in the most recent episode, they did a really cool sequence from book 4. So that's been bringing me a lot of joy, seeing that all play out.
So season 3 is into book 4.
Yeah, they kind of skipped book 3, and they're going to go back to it later at some point.
Kurt, are you familiar with the Wheel of Time series?
I regret to say I
It is a, like, what is it, 17 volumes?
14 in a novella.
14. It's like thousands and thousands. How many pages? Kurt, someone knows this answer. How many pages is that whole series?
Why are you looking at me?
I'm looking to my side because Lauren's right there too.
I have no idea. The books vary in length, but they're all pretty long.
Kate's Googling. So this the author wrote this series and it's super expansive. And then he, of course, like, if you're going to make that commitment, you got to commit to live forever. He dies. Is it Robert Jordan? Is that his name?
Yeah.
And so Brandon Sanderson finishes it. But it's this big, massive fantasy series. How many pages, Kate?
It says just about 12,000 pages with an average of around 826 pages per book.
Yeah.
But if you get the hardcovers, it's only 10,000.
So I don't know how many pages John Adams wrote, but
Interestingly, it was pitched as a trilogy.
there you go. What a world. So there's an Amazon series that does this, but it's
Okay.
like if you want to be a fantasy reader and you want to dig into that, it's like a commitment.
Yeah, that sounds like an effort.
And some probably a very rewarding one, right?
It's quite good.
So the TV series, if you haven't read the books, you say do it.
Definitely.
Okay. All right, Case and Graph, what are you currently watching, reading, listening to, or playing that is bringing you joy?
Well, not to copy Lauren, but I've been listening to The Wheel of Time, as longtime listeners to the podcast will be aware. I'm almost at a year. I'm about a third of the way done with the series. So, it's going to take me a while. I think I'm on book 6. I think and it's called Lord of Chaos. Is that book 6? Perfect. I just started that last week. I went hiking yesterday specifically so I could listen to it. And I'm really enjoying that.
Kids these days.
Telling
Kids
you.
these days spending time outside in the
reading.
out of doors reading books. All right, Ryan, what are you watching, reading, listening to, or playing that's bringing you joy?
So I have said this before, but I am so excited because Reacher season 3 has dropped. Reacher is the best show on television if you think Amazon Prime is TV. I love the show. I mean, granted, it's got a few, swear words here and there, but it is a beautifully written, fun show. And season 3 just dropped, and I think the last episode. So Cammie, my wife, and I, we got all the way up, and we have to always save the last 2. Right? You can't start until you can get to finish it. So we waited until Thursday when the last episode of season 3 comes, and we'll finish it. But I've never read the books, and I can't speak to the Tom Cruise movie because it was okay. But the TV show Reacher, man, that's what's bringing me joy. So, Kurt, thank you for being here. We're going to go out with your last song, which is Please Come to Boston by Dave Loggins. Can you tell us why you chose this song?
Well, I chose that as an invitation to you, so that you would just come and visit. No, it's a great song. I think it's a very well crafted song. If you're into the singer songwriter era at all, I think the way some of those guys, James Taylor, people like that, put songs together, it's worth dissecting them and thinking a little bit. And the lyrics in this song and just the sentiment of this song are I just think really well crafted.
Okay, thank you all for listening to the Apex Radio Hour today. Thank you to Kason and Kate and Lauren for being here, and thanks to Kurt for being our special guest. And we'll go out with the song, but as always, in the words of the great American poet Bill Withers, I wish you well. And this is Please Come to Boston by Dave Loggins. Bring.